Oppensinger was resolute. Quote, sometimes self-interest has to take a backseat to what's right, especially if the choice is between a layoff and a death.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
So let's talk about this ceasefire stuff with the UAW. This is a really, really big deal. The UAW International Union has become the latest and largest union to call for a permanent ceasefire in Gaza. And this is really, I think, kind of representative of a sea change in the labor movement, because unfortunately the labor movement has really been, on the side of Israeli militarism against Palestinian and against the cause of freedom and justice for Palestinians, and it's been kind of a black mark on our movement for a while, and I think the tide is starting to turn. And so here's the specific, like the words of the resolution that they signed on to, that was began by UE, the United Electrical Workers Union. We, members of the American labor movement, mourn the loss of life in Israel and Palestine. We express our solidarity with all workers and our common desire for peace in Palestine and Israel. And we call on President Joe Biden and Congress to push for an immediate ceasefire and an end to the siege of Gaza. We cannot bomb our way to peace. We also condemn any hate crimes against Muslims, Jews, or anyone else. In issuing this call, U.S. unions are joining the efforts of 13 Congress members and others who are calling for an immediate ceasefire. The basic rights of people must be restored. Water, fuel, food, and other humanitarian aid must be allowed into Gaza. Power must be restored, and foreign nationals and Palestinians requiring medical care must be allowed out of Gaza. The Israeli hostages taken by Hamas must be immediately released. Both Hamas and Israel must adhere to standards of international law and Geneva Convention rules of warfare concerning the welfare and security of civilians. There must be a ceasefire in Gaza. The cycle of violence must stop so that negotiations for an enduring peace can proceed. The U.S. must act. We call on President Biden to immediately call for a ceasefire. The road to justice cannot be paved by bombs and war. The road to peace cannot be found through warfare. We commit ourselves to work in solidarity with the Palestinian and Israeli peoples to achieve peace and justice. Union members come from diverse backgrounds, including Jews, Muslims, and Middle Eastern communities. The rising escalation of war and arms sales doesn't serve the interests of workers anywhere. In the end, we all want a place to call home and for our children to be safe. Working people around the world want and deserve to live free from the effects of violence, war, and militarization. Thousands of Americans have joined the groundswell of global solidarity demanding a ceasefire now. It's the labor movement's turn to make our voices heard and demand a ceasefire. Together, we can stand for peace, justice, and a better future for working people everywhere. Please sign this call and add your name to a growing list calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. So a very important statement, and very important that the UAW has signed on. I think it's the right thing to do morally, and I think it makes sense politically. They announced it at a news conference with other union members and activists in D.C. just yesterday on Friday. And Cynthia Nixon was there, a 45-year member of SAG-AFTRA, former gubernatorial candidate in New York State. She spoke at the press conference on Friday and says that unions are about solidarity. Unions are about groups of people with less power and less rights coming together to challenge a more powerful, wealthier, more connected entity. About the little guy standing up to the big guy and demanding justice, fairness, and humane treatment. And that is certainly what we are seeing the Palestinian people do as they implore the bombing to stop. So there was also a recent piece in Jewish Currents by Jeff Shirky from In These Times, but he wrote this for Jewish Currents. The problem of the unionized war machine, and there was a lot of really, really good stuff about how, much like with climate change, and the issue of having so many union members in fossil fuel industries, that presents an impediment to transition. And so, we have to figure out a way to reconcile these differences because it is necessity to move away from fossil fuels. And so we have to figure out how to speak to the concerns, the valid concerns of people in fossil fuel industries, and the way that has been, put forward for decades. I think the person who coined the term just transition was the president of the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union. Oh, shoot. What was his name? The man who, this is his biography, the man who hated work and loved labor. Let's see if I can find his name. Tony Mazzocchi. That's right. It was on the tip of my tongue. Tony Mazzocchi. I think he was the one that coined the term just transition. And basically, it sounds a lot like what it is what it sounds like. It is a transition from a fossil fuel economy, from fossil fuel jobs to clean energy jobs, but it is just because we have seen so many transitions, especially over the course of the last 50 years, that have not been just. Deindustrialization, the outsourcing of American jobs, the absolute destruction of our manufacturing communities. It has not been just because these people who have had these jobs have gone from being solidly middle class, being able to work and make a living oftentimes only on one income, to now not having that job and having to work a much lower paying job, sometimes in the same industry for about half as much, working at a non-union manufacturing facility, or working in a not manufacturing industry, having to work in the service industry where you make even less than half what you used to make, right? If you used to make $40, $50, $35 an hour at a union manufacturing job, and now you're making $15 an hour sometimes working in a restaurant, if that, right? This is an incredibly, that is the example. And that is why so many in the fossil fuel industry are, reluctant when they hear these calls, reasonably so. They're reluctant to go along with, this clean energy stuff because they've seen transitions in the past completely fuck them over, right? And so it's not unreasonable to say, well, why the hell would I trust you, government, industry, society, to transition me in a way that is just and fair and makes sense, right? And so you have to do a lot of work, and you have to actually do the just transition. You have to actually create good paying union jobs in the clean energy economy. And so the same problem exists in the war industry, right? Because I just talked about how the idea that the war industry creates good paying jobs is something of a, is to a certain extent not true.
Hey, 5 seconds. Just wanted to say that this is only possible because of our donors. If you want to see more of this, then consider donating yourself at tvlr.fm/donate.
Because so much of this money has gone to the top. 73% more is going to shareholders in the defense industry now than in 2010. Less money is being spent on research and development. And as all of these companies continue to get more and more and more money from the U.S. government, they are actually increasingly cutting American jobs. And so, the argument that spending more on the military is good for jobs in the American economy, we've talked about how that is not a persuasive argument, but that doesn't do anything for the unionized war machine workers who do have good jobs, because there are good paying union jobs in the war machine, right? And that is a reality that we have to deal with. And so, in the same way that fossil fuel workers look at what has happened to auto workers and say, There's no way that I'm going to want to follow that. That's crazy. Why would I sign on to that? War machine workers are, not unreasonably so, saying, what could I do for a job if we stop spending so much money on defense? I have to have the war machine to feed my family. And that's morally, not really that's not a great argument, but it is one that must be dealt with societally, practically, right? It doesn't matter how we think morally about that, right? The fact is the problem exists and we must do something about it if we are going to transition to a peace economy, to an economy that can and does thrive on peace, to a world where we don't have to, where people don't have to depend on their incomes on war and violence, and where people don't have to experience war and violence and militarization and all of this kind of stuff, right? So we have to have a just transition for the workers in the military-industrial complex. And this has been, just like the fossil fuel industry, this has been something that workers, that union leaders have been thinking about for a long time. And it's not to say that it's been a popular, the idea of a just transition to a peace economy has not been the mainstream position in the labor movement, unfortunately. But it has had high-level adherents. And so one of those adherents was Walter Reuther. And Jeff Shirky talks about this in Jewish Currents. So I'm reading from this article, The Problem of the Unionized War Machine by Jeff Shirky in Jewish Currents. Recognizing that speedily ending the fighting in Southeast Asia, the Vietnam War, would have economic ramifications within the U.S., Reuther argued in 1969 that the weapons contractors, who then employed 3.8 million workers, tens of thousands of whom were UAW members, should be required to avert layoffs by converting their operations to civilian production. The anvil on which peace is hammered out, he said, should not be on the heads and backs of displaced defense workers and their families. And that's such a great quote. And it can't be if we're going to actually do this, because we need their support. We need the support of the labor movement, and the support of the labor movement is going to largely depend on convincing these people who work in these industries that this needs to happen. So the anvil on which peace is hammered out should not be on the heads and backs of displaced workers and their families. So to make this possible, Reuther called on Congress to pass legislation requiring weapons manufacturers to put 25% of their after-tax profits into a federally managed conversion fund, which would be used to pay for retraining and family benefits for workers during a period of economic adjustment. The idea was, in many ways, a precursor to later calls from unionists and fossil fuel-related industries for a just transition to green energy jobs. Another popular and powerful labor leader was William Wimpesinger, who was at one point the international president of the general president of the International Association of Machinists. He was one of the most left-wing and anti-war labor leaders of the Cold War era, interestingly enough, because the Machinists Union represents more workers in the defense industry than any other union in the country. So as an official in the Machinists Union, the union representing the largest number of weapons industry workers in the U.S., Wimpesinger took a principled stance in favor of conversion, saying that he, quote, would hate to think that the members of our union, who are now engaged in the many facets of military production, would have to depend forever on world terror in order to survive as an economic unit. After becoming the Machinists Union president in 1977, Wimpesinger put his principles in action by ending the union's cooperation with weapons industry lobbyists trying to push arms deals through Congress. Unless and until, he said, our country breaks the vicious cycle that seems to chain us to a wartime economy, we are forever going to be prisoners of defense appropriations bills in Congress. In 1978, Wimpesinger went further, vocally, though unsuccessfully, opposing a U.S. plan to sell F-15 fighter jets to Israel, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia, even though the planes were to be produced by Machinists Union members at a Pratt & Whitney factory in Connecticut. I mean, that's a very difficult thing for a labor leader to do, right? After reading this article, I'm going to have to read more about Wimpesinger because he sounds like a very, very interesting figure. Very good guy. So this is him being quoted again. The obvious result of the sales would be to heighten tensions in the region. We need peace, not profits. Such anti-war advocacy often ran into resistance from skeptical Machinists Union members and staff, but Wimpesinger was resolute. Quote, sometimes self-interest has to take a backseat to what's right, especially if the choice is between a layoff and a death. So I think very powerful argument from Wimpesinger and very practical solutions presented by both Walter Reuther and William Wimpesinger, the UAW and Machinist Union's presidents, respectively, during the 60s and 70s.
Well, Jacob, they have the same kind of argument about transitioning from fossil fuels to like green energy, where it's like you're going to destroy all these jobs, but with green energy, you need infrastructure. If you're going to build nuclear plants, you need thousands of hectares of concrete. You need people to maintain this stuff. It's not like changing industries means you'll even have a net loss in jobs in the long run. Things like the New Deal and with building some of the infrastructure we still use around here. I mean, that was incredible amounts of jobs were created for that.
Yeah. And the thing is to make them good jobs, right? Because, and there was just recently a report from Alabama Arise about the auto industry in Alabama and how it has fallen short of a lot of the promises that the auto industry made to the government of Alabama as we shovel hundreds of millions of dollars into their pockets. And that's the reason that people are skeptical of any sort of transition, is because we have seen these transitions to bad paying, bottom of the, low road, bottom of the barrel jobs with low wages, bad working conditions, unsafe working conditions, disrespect on the job, tyrannical corporations. And so we have to make them good paying jobs. We have to make them union jobs, and we have to have the government do like it did during World War II and hold these companies to account and to certain standards, labor standards, and all of this kind of stuff to do an actual just transition in both, for both the defense industry and the fossil fuel industry. So anyway, that's a incredibly, incredibly consequential move from the UAW to endorse a ceasefire in Gaza. Very appreciated, and looking forward to continuing to watch these developments. You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.